At approximately 1100 hours on January 31, 1986, a Soviet air defense radar station on the Kola Peninsula picked up a target it had seen many times before. The return was faint at first, then steady. Altitude somewhere above 20,000 meters, speed exceeding 3 times the speed of sound. Heading east along the Barents Sea coast, just outside Soviet territorial waters, flying as calmly as a scheduled airliner, a duty officer reached for the bell that would scramble the interceptor cruise. The bell was shrill and unmistakable, and one of the men who answered it that morning would spend the rest of his life averse to the sound of bells. He was a captain in the Soviet Air Defense Forces named Mikhail Myagkiy. He flew the newly fielded MiG-25 interceptor known to the West as the Foxhound, and he was about to carry out his 8th attempt to intercept the aircraft that had been sliding along the edge of the motherland for nearly 2 decades. Myagkiy climbed into his cockpit with a burst of adrenaline he would later describe in careful, measured words. The procedure for intercepting the American aircraft was timed down to the second. His fighter had to launch exactly 16 minutes after the initial alert. Every link in the chain, from the radar operators to the ground-controlled intercept officers to the 2-man crew in the interceptor, was driven by the same knowledge. If the timing slipped, the target would be gone. The target, over the years, had almost always been gone. What Myagkiy did not yet know, but would later describe in his interview with the Russian military aviation writer Valery Romanenko, was that this particular attempt would be different. On this one morning, he would actually see the American aircraft with his own eyes. It would be the only time in his career, in 14 such intercepts, that he would. The aircraft he was chasing was a Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the strategic reconnaissance platform that the United States Air Force had been operating along the margins of the Soviet Union since the late 1960s. By January of 1986, the Blackbird had been flying operational missions for nearly 18 years, and in all that time no Soviet fighter had ever managed to bring one down. No surface-to-air missile had ever managed to track one to engagement range and score a hit. The aircraft flew past the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, photographed what it wanted to photograph, and went home. For the men on the Soviet side who had spent their careers trying to stop it, the Blackbird had become something that sat between technical fact and professional folklore. It was the aircraft that could not be caught. The SR-71 Blackbird was a strategic reconnaissance aircraft designed and built by the Lockheed Skunk Works under the direction of Clarence Kelly Johnson, one of the most celebrated aircraft designers in American aviation history. Its development grew out of the earlier A-12 Oxcart program for the Central Intelligence Agency. The first flight of the SR-71 took place on December 22, 1964, at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California, with Lockheed test pilot Robert Gilliland at the controls. The aircraft entered operational service with the United States Air Force at Beale Air Force Base in January of 1966. It would remain in frontline service, with a brief gap, until the initial retirement in 1990, with reactivated airframes flying until 1998, and the very last flight of the type taking place at Edwards Air Force Base on October 9, 1999. The specifications of the aircraft, 60 years after its first flight, still read like a claim that needs to be checked twice. A design cruise speed above Mach 3.2. An operational ceiling, above 85,000 feet, a length of 107 feet, an unfueled weight of approximately 60,000 pounds, most of it titanium. On July 27 and 28, 1976, 2 separate Blackbird crews set world records that still stand. Captain Eldon Joers and Major George Morgan flew SR-71 No. 6 17958 to an absolute speed record of 2,193 miles per hour over a 15 to 25 kilometer course. On the same pair of flights, Captain Robert Helt and Major Larry Elliott in 617962 set an absolute altitude record in sustained level flight of 85,069 feet. No operational aircraft propelled by air-breathing engines has matched either number in the half-century since. The airframe was built predominantly from titanium alloy, a choice forced by physics. Aluminum would have softened and failed at the temperatures sustained supersonic flight produced. At cruise, friction with the atmosphere heated parts of the skin well past 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The leading edges glowed faintly, The canopy became too hot to touch without a glove. The aircraft grew several inches in length during emission from thermal expansion, and its fuel tanks were deliberately built loose on the ground, so they would only seal properly once the airframe warmed. On the tarmac, a parked Blackbird leaked fuel in steady drips onto the concrete beneath it. In flight at altitude and speed, the seams closed, and the tanks held. Most of the titanium ore, in one of the stranger ironies of the Cold War, was sourced through shell companies from the Soviet Union itself, a detail Ben Rich described years later in his memoir of the Skunk Works. The aircraft was powered by two Pratt and Whitney J58 engines, a hybrid design that functioned as a conventional turbojet at low speed and transitioned to a bleed bypass configuration resembling a ramjet at high speed. At cruise, the variable spike inlet produced more than half the thrust, the ejector nozzle produced another quarter, and the core engine itself contributed less than 20%. The fuel was a special low-volatility kerosene called JP7, developed specifically for the Blackbird because standard jet fuel would have ignited from the heat of the airframe alone. JP7 was so difficult to light that the engines had to be started with a chemical injection of triethylborane, a pyrophoric liquid that bursts into flame on contact with air. Every engine carried 16 shots of starter fluid, and every Blackbird startup produced two small green flashes in the nacelles as the fluid lit the fuel. Crews rehearsed each step of the sequence with the care that astronauts applied to spacecraft procedures, because at the Blackbird's operational altitude, the difference between a working systems chain and a broken one was the difference between a landing and a silence. The SR-71 was not just a machine, it was a statement of intent. It represented what American aerospace engineering could produce, in secret, at the height of the Cold War, when the budget was effectively unlimited and the mission was existential. Only 32 airframes were ever built, 29 SR-71A, reconnaissance aircraft, 2 SR-71B trainers, and a single hybrid SR-71C, assembled from surviving pieces of other airframes. The per-unit cost was widely reported at roughly $34 million in mid-1960s currency, which in modern terms exceeds $200 million. The aircraft was flown by a small, carefully selected cadre of pilots and reconnaissance systems officers. Most came from the top of the fighter and bomber pools. They underwent months of specialized training, including extensive work in the pressure suits designed by the David Clark Company of Worcester, Massachusetts, suits that were nearly identical to what NASA astronauts wore on orbital missions, because the environment the Blackbird flew in was, in physical terms, the edge of space. When the Blackbird entered service, the Cold War had settled into its long, grinding middle period. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 3 years in the past. The Vietnam War was escalating. Strategic reconnaissance had become one of the defining activities of the era, because neither superpower could afford to be surprised about what the other was building, deploying, or testing. Before the Blackbird, the United States had relied on the U-2 for deep penetration photography of Soviet territory. But on May 1, 1960, a CIA U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was struck near Kosulino in Sverdlovsk Oblast by an S-75 surface-to-air missile. Powers parachuted, was captured, and was held for 21 months before a prisoner exchange in 1962. The incident was a political catastrophe for the United States and a profound shock to American reconnaissance planners. President Eisenhower suspended manned overflights of the Soviet Union for the rest of his term at the Paris summit in May of 1960. At his press conference in January of 1961, President Kennedy confirmed the policy would continue. Successive administrations reaffirmed it. When the SR-71 entered service 6 years after the Powers shoot-down, the prohibition on deep Soviet overflights was absolute. The Blackbird never crossed the Soviet frontier. It flew in international airspace along the Soviet periphery, collecting imagery and signals intelligence from standoff ranges, gathering what could be seen and heard from outside the border. This is a detail that is sometimes misunderstood. The Blackbird did not fly over the Soviet Union. It flew past it, close enough to collect what it needed, far enough to avoid the political consequences of outright violation. And the fact that the aircraft never crossed the line shaped everything about the Soviet response, because Soviet interceptor pilots were never legally authorized to fire at a target that remained in international airspace. Every encounter was a tracking exercise, a positioning exercise, a rehearsal for a shot that could never be taken. The Blackbird was the answer to the lesson the U-2 had delivered. It was not designed to fight. It carried no weapons of any kind. Its only defense was its performance envelope. The operational doctrine was absolute. If a Blackbird crew detected a surface-to-air missile launch, they were instructed to accelerate and climb. If a fighter attempted intercept, they were instructed to accelerate and climb. The aircraft was built around a single, unshakable idea. Speed and altitude were survival. Nothing else was needed. By the time Soviet radar stations began tracking SR-71 missions along the Far East periphery in the late 1960s, the Soviet Union had built what was arguably the most comprehensive integrated air defense network in the history of warfare. It included layered surface-to-air missile batteries, long-range early warning radars, ground-controlled intercept stations, and dedicated interceptor aircraft of extraordinary performance. The aircraft at the tip of that spear was the MiG-25 Foxbat, a massive twin-engine interceptor that entered Soviet air defense service in 1970. It could reach Mach 2.83 in sustained flight, and brief Mach 3 dashes were possible at the cost of destroying the engines. Its service ceiling depended on its missile load. With 4 R-40 air-to-air missiles, its combat ceiling was roughly 67,900 feet. The radar and fire control system could not solve the closure geometry against a target flying Mach 3.2 at 85,000 feet. The Foxbat had been developed in part to counter American high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. Soviet engineers had believed, when they began the program in the early 1960s, that they were building the machine that would finally close the altitude gap. They were wrong. Not because the Foxbat was a bad aircraft. It was, by every measure, an impressive achievement. It simply could not reach the envelope the Blackbird occupied. The MiG-25 could touch the edge of that envelope in a zoom climb. It could not cruise in it. And a zoom climb, by definition, ends. What the Soviet Air Defense Forces, known by the Russian initials PVO, faced beginning in the late 1960s, was a problem they could not solve. An aircraft was transiting the margins of their airspace at will, photographing military installations, naval bases, missile silos, and industrial facilities, and no weapon in their inventory could reliably stop it. The political and institutional pressure this created was immense. Commanders were held accountable for intrusions. Controllers were disciplined for failed intercepts. Pilots were drilled relentlessly. And every time the real target appeared on their scopes, the same thing happened. The target simply flew away. The Blackbird's operational day, at its home base in California, or at its forward deployment sites at Kadena in Okinawa and Royal Air Force Mildenhall in the United Kingdom, began hours before takeoff. The crew reported to a dedicated facility, underwent a full medical check, and ate a high-protein, low-residue meal of steak and eggs, a meal chosen specifically to minimize digestive activity during the long mission ahead. They were then fitted into the full pressure suit, a painstaking process that took more than 30 minutes and required 2 technicians. They breathed pure oxygen for at least an hour before takeoff to purge nitrogen from their blood. They were driven to the aircraft in an air-conditioned van, so their body temperature would not rise during the walk to the flight line. On the ground, the aircraft was a strange, dripping black silhouette. Fuel leaked from the tanks onto the concrete beneath it. The canopy was open. The pilot and the reconnaissance systems officer climbed a ladder into their respective cockpits, were strapped in, and began a start-up procedure that to an outside observer looked like a small chemical fire igniting inside the engines. Ground crews in protective gear stood by with fire suppression equipment. The physiological support technicians, responsible for the pressure suits and the oxygen systems, conducted final checks through the suit umbilical connections. Every seal was verified. Every hose was confirmed. The slightest failure in the pressure suit at operational altitude would be fatal within seconds, and so the procedures governing the suit and its connections had been developed with extreme care. The aircraft taxied. The aircraft took off. Within minutes of becoming airborne, the Blackbird performed an air refueling rendezvous because it could not lift off with a full fuel load. The aircraft was too heavy at maximum fuel, and so it launched light and immediately met a KC-135Q tanker, a specialized variant dedicated to Blackbird support, for a subsonic refueling to full capacity before climbing to operational altitude. The tanker crews were themselves a small, specialized community. cleared for the mission and trained in its unusual requirements. The JP-7 fuel used by the Blackbird could not be carried in standard tankers, and the KC-135Q had been modified specifically to handle the special fuel and its associated ground support. Once refueled, the Blackbird climbed and accelerated into its operational profile. The transition through Mach 1 and Mach 2 was routine. Mach 3 was the working speed, the speed at which the aircraft was designed to live. At that speed, conversation inside the cockpit was minimal. The crew communicated through the intercom in short, precise phrases. The pilot flew the aircraft. The reconnaissance systems officer monitored the sensors, the navigation, the defensive systems, and the mission timeline. Both men watched their oxygen regulators and their pressure suit integrity indicators continuously. Within half an hour of leaving the ground, the crew was cruising at Mach 3 and looking out at a black sky and a curved horizon. At 85,000 feet, the curvature of the Earth was clearly visible. The sky above was not blue, but a deep, almost black purple, the color of the upper atmosphere where most of the air was already beneath the aircraft. Stars became visible in daylight. The cockpit was heated and air-conditioned by the aircraft's own systems. The outside environment was a physical space closer to orbit than to conventional aviation. Pilots, who had flown fighters and bombers for years before transitioning to the Blackbird, often described the first flight at operational altitude as a kind of transformation, a realization that the aircraft was not simply faster or higher than what they had flown before, but existed in a fundamentally different regime. They had left the realm of ordinary aviation, and somewhere on the other side of the world, a Soviet radar station was about to light up with a return it did not want to see. June 3, 1986, was one of the days when that happened. Majors Brian Boudreau and Ted Ross lifted off from Royal Air Force Mildenhall at 10:10 hours in an SR-71, bound for a standard reconnaissance profile along the Barents and Baltic coastlines. The mission was to monitor Warsaw-Pact troop movements along the Iron Curtain and photograph the Soviet Northern Fleet's submarine ports on the Kola Peninsula. By the standards of that deployment, it was a routine sortie. The pattern had been flown many times. What made June 3 unusual was what the Soviets did in response. According to the account later documented by the British aviation historian Paul Crickmore in his book on Blackbird operations in Europe, as the SR-71 traversed its track over the Barents Sea, 6 Soviet fighters were scrambled in a coordinated pattern. Each was separated from the next by roughly 15 miles. They positioned themselves to present the Blackbird with a multi-angle engagement geometry. Had the American aircraft for any reason strayed inside Soviet airspace, or had it lost any element of its performance envelope, the geometry would have offered the Soviet pilots a credible shot from several directions simultaneously. The Blackbird did not stray. It did not lose its envelope. It flew its profile at Mach 3, at cruising altitude, and passed through the engagement zone without incident. The Soviet fighters held their positions for as long as their fuel allowed. No missiles were launched. The geometry that had taken months to develop had brought the Soviet pilots as close to a firing solution as the PVO had ever achieved against the Blackbird, and it still had not been close enough. As Boudreau rolled out of the collection zone, a white contrail shot beneath the nose of the SR-71. For a heartbeat, both crew members wondered if it was a missile. It was neither missile nor aircraft. It was the Blackbird's own contrail, laid a few minutes earlier on the preceding leg, still hanging in the cold, thin air of the upper stratosphere. This pattern of coordinated, ultimately unsuccessful intercepts had been unfolding for nearly 2 decades. The first SR-71 operational mission had been flown on March 21, 1968, from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, with Majors Jerome O'Malley and Edward Payne aboard aircraft 617976. The target was North Vietnam. The imagery they brought back revealed concealed North Vietnamese artillery around Khe Sanh, and both crew members received the Distinguished Flying Cross. From Kadena, the Blackbird would eventually fly missions along the Chinese coast, around North Korea, and across the full Pacific margin of the Soviet Far East. From April of 1976 onward, aircraft began deploying on temporary rotation to Royal Air Force Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. In April of 1982, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher announced that a permanent 2-aircraft detachment would be based at Mildenhall. The European detachment flew the Barents and Baltic coastlines for the remainder of the decade. Initial Soviet reactions to the Blackbird reconstructed from later interviews, Russian aviation literature, and declassified American intelligence assessments, suggested a period of genuine confusion when the aircraft first appeared on Soviet radar scopes. The early returns did not match any known aircraft signature. The speed seemed implausible. The altitude seemed implausible. It took some time for the Soviet air defense system to fully classify the Blackbird as an aircraft. Once it was classified, the classification changed everything and changed nothing. The PVO now knew what it was chasing. It still could not catch it. The aircraft type, the sensor equipment, and the mission profile remained highly classified throughout the Blackbird's operational career. But patterns became visible to the men on the other side of the line. Soviet pilots and air defense officers, in the years after the Cold War ended, gave interviews and wrote memoirs that described what the encounters had been like from their side. The picture that emerged was one of professional frustration layered over grudging respect. The Blackbird, inside the PVO, had acquired a reputation that transcended technical evaluation. It was the aircraft that came and went as it pleased. It was, in the private conversations of senior officers, a standing rebuke to the Soviet design bureaus that had never quite managed to produce its equal. Captain Mikhail Myagkiy, later Guards Major, and retired in 1992 at the age of 36, became one of the most detailed voices in that record. His interview with the Russian military aviation writer Valery Romanenko, conducted for Paul Crickmore's revised edition of his book on the Blackbird, is one of the most thoroughly documented Soviet accounts of the intercept attempts. Myagkiy had arrived at the 174th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment at Monchegorsk in October of 1983. The regiment had been flying the MiG-31 Foxhound for 18 months by then and had frequently been tasked against the SR-71. Myagkiy flew his first SR-71 intercept from Combat Alert on August 21, 1984. Over the next 2.5 years, he would fly 14 such missions. Most of them followed the same arc. The scramble, the climb, the detection, the brief approach to engagement parameters, and then the target, already at the edge of the envelope, pulling away. The MiG-31 was the Soviet Union's answer to the problem the Blackbird represented. Development of the new interceptor had begun in the early 1970s under the Mikoyan Design Bureau. The first prototype flew on September 16, 1975. The State Acceptance Act was signed in December of 1981, with initial deliveries beginning in 1982, and the first fully operational regiment fielded in 1983. The aircraft carried a new radar called Zaslon, the first passive electronically scanned array fire control radar ever fielded on a fighter. It could detect a target the size of a heavy bomber at around 200 kilometers, track 10 targets simultaneously, and engage 4. It was integrated with an infrared search and track sensor and a data link that allowed a flight of 4 MiG-31s to sweep a zone 800 to 900 kilometers wide. The standard long-range armament was 4 R-33 semi-active radar homing missiles, roughly analogous to the American AIM-54 Phoenix, with a range of about 120 kilometers. The aircraft carried a crew of 2, a pilot and a weapons systems officer in tandem cockpits. The 174th Guards Regiment's intercept sector ran from Karlovka to Cape Sviatoy Nos along the Murmansk coast. The tactical sequence, as Myagkiy described it, was strict and unforgiving. From alert to takeoff was 16 minutes. The standard combat load was 4 R-33s plus 4 shorter-range R-60 missiles, with the R-60s typically removed before a high-altitude launch because they would be disabled above Mach 1.75. The primary sensor in the intercept approach was not the radar, but the infrared search and track system, kept active while the radar itself was deliberately switched off. The reason was simple. The Zaslon was a brand new system. If it were radiating on every SR-71 intercept attempt, American electronic intelligence aircraft would map its combat frequencies and waveforms within weeks. Ground vectoring altitude was about 16,000 meters, roughly 52,000 feet. Attack altitude was 18 to 19,000 meters. Zoom climbs reached 20,000 meters, just under 66,000 feet, for missile launch geometry. Myakkiy's summary of the overall situation, as recorded by Romanenko, was direct. If the SR-71 had violated Soviet airspace, he said, a live missile launch would have been carried out. And in his professional assessment, There was practically no chance the aircraft could have avoided an R-33 at the ranges the MiG-31 could achieve. But in the early 1980s, the Blackbirds did not violate the border. They came close. They, as he put it, sometimes tickled it. They never crossed it. And so every intercept he flew was a simulation of a shot he was never permitted to take. The January 31, 1986, mission was the exception in one specific sense. It was the only one of his 14 intercepts on which Myagkiy actually saw the American aircraft with his own eyes. The crew in the back seat that day was Alexei Parshin, a substitute weapons systems officer. The ground vectoring station was Gremika. After the alarm bell and a rapid cockpit check, the MiG-31 went into afterburner with a 60-degree right bank, turning to a course of 100 degrees. It passed through the sound barrier in horizontal flight at 8,000 meters, climbed again, and at 16,000 meters turned left to a combat course of 360. The weapons officer activated the infrared search and track system. Within 5 seconds it captured the target. The voice warning in the headphones announced, in Russian, attack. They continued climbing from 16,000 meters. At roughly 60 kilometers out, Myagkiy spotted the Blackbird's contrail on an intersecting course. He zoomed the MiG to just under 19,000 meters. The SR-71 was 3,000 to 4,000 meters above him, still at cruise. He passed underneath it. He could actually see the black silhouette of the American aircraft. It was flying carefully along a parallel track, 60 kilometers out from the coast, and then it was gone, departing faster than he could follow. He landed at his regiment base with his missiles still on the rails. It is important to note what this account does and does not claim. Myagkiy did not shoot down an SR-71. No MiG-31 ever did. What he achieved was a successful detection and a brief positional window during which a missile engagement might theoretically have been attempted if the rules had permitted it. His own description, as translated from the Romanenko interview, describes infrared detection rather than active radar tracking, because the Zaslon was deliberately kept off during these intercepts to protect its combat frequencies from American electronic intelligence. Over the entire operational life of the SR-71 Blackbird, no Blackbird was ever lost to enemy action. Not to a MiG, not to a surface-to-air missile, not to any hostile system on any continent. Other Soviet accounts, collected from radar operators, ground-controlled intercept officers, and regimental pilots across multiple PVO armies, describe the same pattern. The interceptors had to be positioned, fueled, and timed with extraordinary precision to even come close to engagement parameters. A typical attempt required the MiG to be at high altitude and near maximum speed before the Blackbird entered the engagement zone, because the interceptor could not accelerate or climb fast enough to catch a target that already held any advantage in energy. This meant the Soviet system had to launch its aircraft well in advance of a predicted Blackbird track and hope the estimate was correct. When the estimate was wrong, the interceptor either reached the intercept point too early and burned through its fuel, or arrived too late and watched the target depart at Mach 3. When the timing was correct, the geometry still worked against the interceptor. The Blackbird typically flew higher than the MiG could sustain, and the narrow engagement windows produced by the altitude and closure speed differential meant that most theoretical shots were never taken in practice. 12 SR-71s were lost during the program's operational life, every one of them to accident, mechanical failure, or pilot error. By the end of fiscal year 1989, Air Force Blackbirds had flown 3,551 operational sorties. The Kadena detachment alone accounted for more than 2,400. The commonly cited folklore figure of 4,000 enemy missiles fired at Blackbirds over the career of the program does not appear in any primary archival source. The most defensible career figure comes from Ben Rich, who led the Skunk Works after Kelly Johnson. In his 1994 memoir, he wrote that the Blackbirds had more than 100 SA, 2 missiles fired at them over the years. The first documented launch took place on July 26, 1968, over North Vietnam, against an aircraft flown by Majors Tony Bevacqua and Jerry Crew. The last publicly acknowledged hostile launch took place on August 26, 1981, when North Korean air defense units fired 2 missiles at Majors Maury Rosenberg and Ed McKim near the demilitarized zone. Both missiles missed by miles. The only Blackbird family aircraft ever actually struck by a surface-to-air missile was an earlier 12, piloted by Dennis Sullivan over North Vietnam on October 28, 1967, lightly damaged by shrapnel from a near-miss detonation. There is also the matter of electronic countermeasures. The SR-71 carried a sophisticated suite of defensive electronics, including radar warning receivers, signal analyzers, and active jamming systems. When a Soviet surface-to-air missile radar locked onto the aircraft, the defensive systems would detect the lock, identify the emitter type, and employ countermeasures specific to that threat. The jamming was precise, targeted, and updated regularly as Soviet radar types evolved. The aircraft was not only too fast and too high. It was, in the electronic domain, a moving target that most missiles simply could not hold. The Soviet response to the Blackbird, over the decades, took several forms. Each one, in its own way, failed to close the gap. The MiG-25 Foxbat was the first major answer and produced an impressive aircraft that could not quite catch the target it had been designed to catch. The MiG-31 Foxhound, with its Zaslon radar and R-33 missiles, produced a more capable aircraft whose engagement envelope came closer than anything before. But the Blackbird's performance envelope, in the specific geometry of a clean, on-profile flight outside Soviet territorial waters, remained just beyond the Foxhound's reach for a reliable kill. Soviet surface-to-air missile development continued throughout the period, producing systems of genuinely formidable capability, such as the S-200, with its engagement ceiling above 40 kilometers. The S-200 was kinematically capable of reaching the Blackbird. Yet across the operational career of the program, no S-200 ever scored a confirmed hit on an SR-71. There was also a human dimension to the frustration. Soviet interceptor pilots of the era were professionally proud men. They trained to the highest standards of their service. They flew aircraft of genuine capability, and year after year they were sent up to catch the Blackbird and return to their bases having failed. It was not a failure of skill. It was a failure of the equipment they had been given. But in any military culture, failure accumulates. On the Swedish side of the Baltic, a different kind of intercept campaign was unfolding, often overlooked in the American telling. Swedish Air Force pilots flying the JA-37 Viggen from the wing based at Bråvalla developed a coordinated technique for head-on intercepts of SR-71s transiting the narrow Baltic corridor. In January of 1986, 3 Viggen pilots, including Per Olof Eld, Major Muller, and Captain Ulf Johansson, carried out a series of successful practice intercepts against an SR-71 at 22,000 meters and Mach 2.9. Eld himself recorded 5 such intercepts over the course of his career. The most consequential Swedish encounter came on June 29, 1987. On that day, Lieutenant Colonels Dwayne Knoll and Tom Veltri were flying an SR-71 on the Baltic run when the Wright J58 engine suffered a catastrophic failure at cruise altitude. The aircraft descended rapidly. At roughly 25,000 feet, it drifted into Swedish airspace. 4 Viggens, flown by Colonel Lars Erik Blad, Major Roger Moeller, Major Krista Sjöberg, and Lieutenant Bo Ignell, intercepted the crippled Blackbird and escorted it safely toward Danish airspace at 12,000 feet. Knoll and Veltri eventually made an emergency landing at Nordholz, West Germany, with the aircraft intact and the crew unharmed. More than 3 decades later, on November 28, 2018, at a ceremony in Stockholm, all 4 Swedish pilots were awarded the United States Air Medal by Major General John Williams. Knoll, speaking at the ceremony, said that because of the Swedish pilots there had been no international incident, that the United States Air Force had not lost an irreplaceable aircraft, and that 2 crew members were alive to say thank you. On October 6, 1986, a few months after the Myagkiy intercept and the Boudreaux coordinated engagement, came one of the most evocative American pilot accounts of the entire Blackbird era. The crew that day was Major Ed Yeilding, pilot, and Major Curt Osterheld, reconnaissance systems officer. The aircraft was SR-71 No. 617980. The mission was a Barents Sea track near the Murmansk coastline. The flight duration, per Yeilding's own later recollection, was 4.1 hours. Yeilding wrote about the mission in detail for Paul Crickmore's book. At 71,000 feet and Mach 3, just outside Soviet territorial waters, Yeilding looked ahead and saw a long, bright white Russian contrail approaching at much lower altitude. He knew it had to be a Soviet fighter, almost certainly a MiG-31, the newest Soviet supersonic interceptor. He raised the periscope in his cockpit and looked back. He could see his own contrail stretching behind him, and he understood that the MiG pilot could see that contrail just as clearly. He realized that the Soviet pilot had orders to fire his missiles if the Blackbird drifted over Soviet territorial waters, and he assumed, reasonably, that the pilot would welcome the opportunity. Flying toward each other in their supersonic aircraft, Yeilding later wrote that he was reminded of two medieval knights galloping at full speed from opposite ends of a field, except that he carried no weapon. He saw the grey metal of the interceptor briefly at his low left 730 position, at the top of a steep contrail climb. The MiG's nose appeared to drop below the horizon as it ran out of airspeed at around 65,000 feet, some 10,000 feet below the Blackbird. Yeilding and Osterheld held their course and took their pictures. The MiG fell away. Back at Mildenhall during the debrief, the intelligence officer told the crew with near certainty that the interceptor had been a MiG-31. Yeilding would go on, 3.5 years later, to fly the Blackbird on its final delivery flight to the Smithsonian, setting 4 world speed records in the process. But on that morning in October 1986, he added one more to the long record of close encounters between the SR-71 and the Soviet interceptor force, encounters in which both sides held their fire and both sides went home. The Blackbird program officially ended its first operational career in the early months of 1990. The reasons for retirement were complex, partly political, and partly budgetary. The aircraft was expensive to operate, satellite reconnaissance had matured, and Air Force Chief of Staff General Larry Welch had led an internal campaign to redirect Blackbird funds to the B-2 bomber program. Welch's argument, repeated in interviews, was that the Blackbird carried no weapons and dropped no bombs, and was therefore not worth its operating costs. The argument carried, over the strong objections of the intelligence community, the Commander-in-Chief of United States Atlantic Command, and a handful of senators including John Glenn of Ohio. Glenn, himself a former combat pilot and astronaut, took the Senate floor on March 7, 1990, the day after the final delivery flight, and declared that the termination of the SR-71 was a grave mistake that could place the nation at a serious disadvantage in a future crisis. His words went into the congressional record and have been quoted many times since. A small number of SR-71s were returned to service in the mid-1990s after Congress restored funding in 1994, and NASA operated the aircraft as a research platform until 1999. The very last flight of an SR-71 took place at the Edwards Air Force Base Open House on October 9, 1999, with NASA pilot Ed Schneider at the controls of 617980, the same airframe that Yeilding and Osterheld had flown on the Medieval Knights mission. The retirement of the Blackbird coincided, roughly, with the final years of the Soviet Union itself. By the time the last operational sortie was flown, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Warsaw Pact had dissolved, and the country the aircraft had been built to observe was in the process of ceasing to exist. The Soviet air defense system that had spent more than 2 decades trying to catch the Blackbird was about to be reorganized, partitioned, and in many regions dismantled entirely. The MiG-25 and MiG-31 interceptors that had chased the Blackbird remained in service with successor states, primarily Russia, but the institutional continuity that had defined the encounter during the Cold War was broken forever. Today, the surviving Blackbirds are distributed across museums in the United States and one in the United Kingdom. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, displays aircraft 617-972, the airframe flown by Lieutenant Colonels Ed Yeilding and Joseph Vida on the record-setting final delivery flight of March 6, 1990, from Palmdale to Washington Dulles in 1 hour, 4 minutes, and 20 seconds. The Museum of Aviation in Warner Robins, Georgia, displays 617958, the aircraft that set the absolute speed record in 1976. The Imperial War Museum at Duxford, in the United Kingdom, holds 617962, the aircraft that set the absolute altitude record on the same pair of flights. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, displays 617976, the aircraft that flew the first operational mission in 1968. The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum in McMinnville, Oregon, the Castle Air Museum in California, the Kansas Cosmosphere, the 8 Air Force Museum at Barksdale in Louisiana, and several other institutions hold additional airframes from the 32 that Lockheed built. Visitors can walk beneath the long black fuselage, look up at the titanium skin, and see the machine that spent 24 years as the fastest operational air-breathing aircraft ever flown. The skin is still black. The intakes are still menacing. The long delta wings still suggest, even in stillness, the speed the aircraft once carried. Children stand beside their parents and look up at the underside of the aircraft and ask how fast it went. Parents who lived through the Cold War answer with figures that the actual performance does not require them to exaggerate. Veterans of the Air Force occasionally identify themselves to the docents and say that they worked on the program or supported it or knew someone who flew it. The aircraft itself is silent. It does not explain what it did or where it went or what it saw, but the record is there. In declassified documents, in crew memoirs, in the photographs and signals intelligence it produced, in the professional recollections of the men on both sides of the line who were part of its story. The Central Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, and the United States Air Force have over the decades released portions of the intelligence take from Blackbird missions, enough to let historians reconstruct what the aircraft contributed to American strategic understanding during the later Cold War. The Blackbird provided imagery during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, flying non-stop round trips from bases in New York and North Carolina when the British government declined recovery at Mildenhall. It flew over the eastern Mediterranean during the Israeli operations in Lebanon in 1982. It flew post-strike damage assessment missions over Libya in April of 1986, in the aftermath of the United States bombing raids. It flew over the Persian Gulf in 1987, photographing Iranian silkworm missile batteries that threatened commercial shipping. The lesson of the Blackbird, viewed from the perspective of the men who tried and failed to intercept it, was not about weapons. It was about engineering ambition. A single program, pursued with enough resources and enough clarity of purpose, can produce a capability so far beyond what adversaries can match that it reshapes the strategic landscape for a generation. The Blackbird was such a program. It was funded through the most expensive years of the Cold War. It was staffed with some of the most gifted engineers and pilots the United States produced. It flew in a performance envelope that no one else could reach, and it flew there long enough to give American strategic planners a continuous view of the Soviet periphery at a moment when such a view was priceless. For the Soviet pilots who encountered the aircraft and could not catch it, the experience became part of the professional identity of a generation of interceptor crews. Mikhail Myagkiy, the unnamed PVO pilots who flew the coordinated intercept of June 3, 1986, the Finau Eberswalder Foxbat squadron whose lone fighter always completed its stern approach 3 kilometers behind the departing Baltic Express, the ground controllers and radar operators who sat through 12-hour watches at concrete stations from Kamchatka to the Kola Peninsula, tracking the same distinctive return year after year. None of them ever brought one down. None of them, according to their own later testimony, fully expected to. What they had done instead was participate in a pattern of encounter unique in Cold War military aviation, in which the defending force of the most heavily armed nation on Earth met a foreign reconnaissance aircraft on a near-weekly basis and did not succeed in stopping it once. The earliest Soviet reactions, reconstructed years later from the Russian aviation press, described disbelief. A target at that speed and altitude was not possible. A target that could not be caught by the best interceptor in the inventory was not possible, and yet every time the radar return appeared, the impossibility was confirmed again. The later Soviet pilots, like Myagkiy, who inherited the problem and the accumulated institutional knowledge of their predecessors, approached each attempt with a more realistic assessment. They knew what they were chasing. They knew the odds they faced. They climbed anyway, because climbing was the mission. What emerged from their professional ranks over the years, and was eventually shared in post-Cold War interviews and memoirs, was an assessment of respect. Not admiration, which in a military culture is complicated by adversarial relationships, but respect, the kind of recognition a professional pilot reserves for a machine he understands and cannot defeat. Viktor Belenko, the Soviet pilot who defected to Japan with his MiG-25 on September 6, 1976, summarized the situation in the biography that American journalist John Barron published in 1980. The SR-71, Belenko said, flew too high and too fast. The MiG-25 could not reach it or catch it. The missiles above 27,000 meters were useless. Even if the Foxbat could have reached the altitude, its weapons lacked the velocity to overtake the Blackbird in a tail chase, and its guidance could not adjust quickly enough to the closing speed of a head-on shot. Belenko was writing 4 years before Myagkiy's first intercept attempt at the wheel of a newer aircraft with a better radar and a better missile. The same fundamental problem, in different geometry, had remained unsolved. The story of the Blackbird and its Soviet pursuers is, in the end, the story of a performance envelope that one side could reach and the other could not. It was not a story of combat. What the two sides produced together, across more than 2 decades of near-weekly encounters along the Soviet periphery, was a documented record of professional restraint on both sides. An aircraft that came, photographed and went home. A defending air force that watched, tracked, positioned itself, and held its fire because the rules did not permit otherwise, and because even when a pilot like Myagkiy achieved a theoretical firing solution, the moment passed before it could be converted into a shot. The Blackbird is in museums now. The pilots on both sides are in their late 70s and older. The declassified archives and the published memoirs have filled in much of what could not be said publicly at the time. Brian Shul flew the Libya damage assessment mission and wrote Sled Driver. Richard Graham commanded the Kadena detachment and wrote SR-71 Revealed. Paul Crickmore interviewed both Americans and Russians and produced the most complete record in print. On the Russian side, Valery Romanenko captured Myagkiy's account while the memory was still precise, and John Barron captured Belenko's assessment within 4 years of his defection. Taken together, the testimony from the men who flew and the men who tried to stop them forms a record that has no close parallel in Cold War military aviation, a record of an encounter that was defined, ultimately, not by what the two sides did to each other, but by what they did not do. No shot was taken by the Blackbird, no shot that was taken by the other side ever connected. When the program was finally retired, it was retired for reasons having more to do with American budget politics than with any Soviet countermeasure, and the men on both sides who had spent careers in that long, silent contest understood, even when they could not say so publicly, exactly what they had witnessed. An aircraft that had flown where no adversary could reach it for a quarter century and had come home every time.